Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Beacom. I'm with NACD as their forestry specialist and want to welcome you to the Iowa Watershed Improvements breakout session. The Iowa Flood Center has leveraged their skills and expertise to bring over $100 million to the state of Iowa to implement the Iowa Watershed Approach. In this session, Iowa Flood Center staff will discuss how the program brings Iowans together to help reduce flood impacts, improve water quality, and increase community flood resilience. The presentation will be delivered to you by Breanna Shea and Kate Giannini with the Iowa Flood Center. Breanna Shea is the communications specialist for the Iowa Flood Center based at the University of Iowa. Before joining the IFC in 2015, she worked for the Johnson County Soil and Water Conservation District and the Polk County SWCD offices. Her educational background and work experiences have helped her build a career in bringing federal, state, and local partners together to find solutions to flooding and water resource concerns. She develops and implements communications and outreach programs for Iowa Flood Center projects and serves as an effective and knowledgeable liaison between IFC staff and external stakeholders, including agency personnel, policymakers, community leaders, and the general public. Kate Chanini leads outreach, communication, and research activities for the Iowa Watershed Approach program at the Iowa Flood Center. She serves as liaison between IIHR researchers, Iowa Watershed Approach partners, and external stakeholders. Previously, she had worked nearly 10 years at the Johnson County SWCD office and is currently serving her third term as Soil Commissioner in Washington County, Iowa. Before I pass the floor to our speakers, I'd like to remind all of our participants today that both Breanna and Kate are online to answer your questions during this presentation in your chat box. Breanna and Kate, thank you again for being with us. Welcome, and the floor is now yours.
Hi, everyone. My name is Breanna Shea, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Kate Giannini. And Kate and I, we both work on outreach and communications at the Iowa Flood Center. And we've prepared kind of a dual presentation for you today, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Iowa Flood Center. And then Kate is going to talk more specifically about a program that she leads communications and outreach on called the Iowa Watershed Approach. So we'll go ahead and get started. It's important for me to lead with talking about Iowa Flood Center's parent organization, which is IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering. And IIHR is a unit of the University of Iowa's College of Engineering. And we have about over 100 years of expertise related to studying all things fluid and water resources related. So we've got a great team of students and faculties and researchers that come together to develop some of the most advanced science and technology that we can to come up with innovative solutions to try and solve some of our greatest water resource challenges. And so these are just some of the images of some of our state-of-the-art facilities that we have at IIHR. We were actually supposed to celebrate our 100th year anniversary last year, and that got postponed because of the pandemic, but we're hoping to do that in 2022. So if at the end of this presentation you're interested in learning more about that, we can share some more information and details for you. Now, in 2008, some of you may remember that Iowa made national news because of the 2008 floods that ended up impacting 86 of Iowa's 99 counties. It caused over $9 billion in damages from that event and was really just a catastrophe that people could not plan and prepare for, just because we didn't have the right resources and information and tools available to know that this amount of water was moving towards them. And this is just a look at the city of Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 2008. You can see how the community was inundated by this event. Prior to 2008, the Cedar River at Cedar Rapids had only crested at 20 feet. And in 2008, they received a river crest of 31 feet. And that at the time was rated as one of the top 5 FEMA-related disasters that they had ever had. And since then, the city has done a really good job of planning and preparing for future events of this size and magnitude. But it was really this event and the devastation that occurred from that led to the creation of the Iowa Flood Center in the spring of 2009. So there were a group of key legislators and then academics at the University of Iowa that came together to establish the Iowa Flood Center. So recognizing we really needed a center that was devoted to studying floods, doing flood-related research, and making sure that something like this never happened at this size and magnitude again that caught us so off guard and left communities across the state so devastated. So the Iowa Flood Center was established and was made a home at IIHR, Hydroscience and Engineering, just again because of that rich history and expertise that already existed there. The director of the Iowa Flood Center is Witold Krajewski, and the co-founder is Larry Weber, and they're both currently still there and are active leaders that help lead our team and help us with the projects that we work on. And so since our establishment, a couple of the key things that we focus on are developing real-time flood forecasting for the state of Iowa. And we've also done a lot of floodplain and inundation mapping and community-specific inundation maps that I'll showcase and highlight. We work to improve flood monitoring, again, by deploying a dense instrumentation network across the state, which I'll showcase. And then, of course, it's really important that we share these resources and expertise with all of the officials and stakeholders and partners that we work with. And that's really important because a lot of the people that are our main audience, there's constant turnover in those positions. And so that outreach and education piece is ongoing. And insist in the development of a workforce for the state. So because we are an academic research center, we have students that work at our facility. And so it's part of our mission to help educate that next generation of students to work in water resources. And I talked about the 2008 floods as being kind of the impetus that led to the establishment of the Iowa Flood Center, but really we've had devastating flooding pretty much every year since 2008 in some location across the state. And just looking at the flood impacts that we've had in Iowa over the last 30 years based on FEMA data that we have for disaster declarations, you can see that we've had over 1,000 different counties included in those presidential disaster declarations. And property losses during this time period have totaled over $15 billion, and crop losses have totaled over $5 billion during this same time period. And this comes from data from FEMA and the US Department of Ag. And I show this because we're trying to prepare for this increase in the frequency of magnitude of flood events that we're seeing across the state of Iowa. Most recently, the flood events that have impacted us have been the 2018 and the 2019 floods. So during that time period, Iowa had its wettest 12-month period on record since official records began being kept starting in 1895. And this is just a look at some of those flood impacts for a small community in Southwest Iowa called Hamburg. And our team actually visited Hamburg after this first flood impact in 2019 to help clean up some of the debris. And it was really eye-opening for us to just see the types of devastation and how displaced it caused people and members from this community. This is just another look to show you the extent of that flooding that occurred near Hamburg and on the western side of the state near the Missouri River. So on the left, we're looking at some satellite images of the Missouri River and the Nishnabotna rivers under what we would consider pretty normal river conditions. And then in March 16th, 2019, this is what those satellite images showed. And this was after we had a really one of our most wet falls that we've ever had on record in 2018. And then we had the bomb cyclone that hit the central US. So we had really freezing temperatures. So soils were frozen and very saturated. Then we had snowpack on top of that. And then as things started to warm up and that snow and ice started to melt, then we really had a lot of problems both on the Missouri River and the Mississippi River and some of our interior rivers across the state as well. So I mentioned the Missouri River and the impacts in Hamburg, but on the other side of the state, this is a look at Davenport, Iowa on the Mississippi River. And this is following a levee breach scenario that they had there in their community too. So flooding is very top and foremost for a lot of the stakeholders that we're involved with. And we really try and come up with tools and resources just to help them be better informed and plan ahead and prepare for these types of events. So one of the things that we've done to try and do that, and this is kind of one of the key things that we've done for the state of Iowa, is develop a really dense network of bridge sensors or stream stage sensors. So this image is of one of our stream sensors that we have in action. And we mount these on the downstream sides of bridges across the state. And they operate using an ultrasonic transducer. That's that little silver cylinder on the bottom there. And they're self-contained. They use a solar panel, and then they communicate river levels every 15 minutes using a cell modem, and they send this information to an online platform that we've developed called the Iowa Flood Information System, which I'll reference throughout this presentation and then talk a little bit more about at the end. So we currently have over 280 of these bridge sensors deployed. And most recently, we just got finished deploying about 30 of these through a project with a Iowa Silver Jackets team. That's a team of interagency state partners who came together to try and figure out where could we get some more of these deployed out in the field to try and enhance flood monitoring and prediction and fill in some of the monitoring gaps across the state. The Iowa Department of Natural Resources have funded that most recent batch of sensors, and they've also funded about 150 other of those. We've also had sensors funded through the Iowa Department of Transportation. We use some of our base funding from the state to add more of these to our network every year. And then some small communities have recognized the benefits of funding these locally as well too. So these are definitely one of our most popular tools that we have, and our network complements the U.S. Geological Survey's network of about 150 USGS gauges that are out there. So our sensors typically send a focus on more of the smaller streams and tributaries throughout the state, and the USGS network tends to focus on those larger river networks. So together we have one of the most densest networks in the country for having information about what river levels are doing. Our sensors are a little bit different in the USGS in that ours aren't measuring discharge. They're really just measuring that river level. And then officials, individuals, community members can access information from those in real time from that flood information system platform. And another partner that I should also mention is the Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management. They've also been a huge advocate for these because, of course, their emergency responders use these very frequently when we have high intense flood events going on. And they have helped us with making updates to the cell modem technologies. And also it costs us about $10 a month to pay for the cell phone fees for these. And Homeland Security has also helped us with that as well. So it's been a really great collaborative partnership with all of these other state agencies and also local communities that we've worked with. And in 2019, we actually won the Tom Lee State Award for this Iowa Bridge Sensor Project in conjunction with all of the partners that we work with through the Association of State Floodplain Managers. The next thing I want to talk about is our statewide hydrologic network. So since our establishment, we've had a goal to have one of these hydrologic networks deployed in every county throughout Iowa. So we'd like to have about 100 of these stations deployed to help us better predict floods, assess droughts, and just better understand and manage water resources. And because a lot of the hydrologic and watershed modeling work that we do, it really helps us understand what's happening on the ground. And typically when we deploy stations like these, we're working with private landowners who host the stations. And so then they also get the added benefit of having access to the information and the data that they collect. So this background image is an image of kind of our first model of hydro station, or we called these dual tipping bucket rain gauges. And so the first set of these was actually deployed through a project that we had with NASA in 2013. And we worked with partners up in Northeast Iowa in the Turkey River Watershed Basin to deploy a dense network of these through a global precipitation measurement mission that was trying to better understand the strengths and limitations of satellite products for flood forecasting. So that was a really neat project. We were able to keep some of these deployed after that project even ended. We've since brought a lot of them back into our shops for assessment and maintenance. And now we're actually trying to move forward more with a more state-of-the-art station. So that's what you see in the box on the right-hand side. This is our newer version of the hydrologic model that's on a tripod stand. And through the Iowa Watershed Approach program that Kate does the communications and outreach for, we have 20 of these deployed. So we're hoping to get another roughly 80 or so deployed across the state to again help with that dense network that we would like to see. Both of these stations, the dual tipping bucket gauges and the hydro stations, they collect data on precipitation, soil moisture and temperature, and they also are co-located with a shallow groundwater well. So they give really good information about what the hydrologic conditions are like. I mentioned that the legislation that established us, one of the things that we are, as part of our mission, is to create flood forecasts for the state of Iowa. And we have the information from the stream sensors available at those 280 locations, but we know that we have a lot of other river communities that we need to provide this information for as well. And so we're able to provide these forecasts for 1,000 other river locations. And this just gives people a sense of what the flood threats might be for their area. So it's just another way to kind of fill in the flood monitoring and the forecasting that we provide for the state. Another key project that we have are these community flood inundation maps. And this is a look at the current list that we have for communities across the state. And we've also have maps for pools 11 through 19 on the Missouri River or the Mississippi River as well. And these maps are very popular because they allow us to create scenario-based maps that show the flood extent and depth for predicted floodwaters. And I'll walk you through kind of what these look like if you were to navigate to these in the Iowa Flood Information System platform. We typically add about 3 new communities every year. This is a look at what you would see if you went to IFAS and you clicked on Cedar Rapids, for instance. And if I set the stage to 31 feet, which is what the river crested at in 2008, this shows you the extent, and also you can look at the depth of the floodwaters at that event. And because IFAS is based on this Google Maps flood interface, you can then change to satellite view and really get a good understanding of some of the infrastructure and the locations that were impacted by these events. They reference a USGS gauge there in the middle, you can see that. So under real-time events, communities have access to looking at that information, seeing the timing of when those rivers are supposed to crest, and then they can use these maps to plan and prepare and make better informed decisions during these types of events. So in 2016, Cedar Rapids actually used these maps when they were getting ready to experience their second highest flood crest that they had ever had. And this time around, much differently than in 2008, they had a lot more information through IFAS that they could reference and use, and they were able to bring in some 12 miles of HESCO barriers to support and protect their downtown area, and really helped to save a lot of financial impacts from that flood event, and also protects people that lived in those communities a lot better than in 2008. And we're also adding to these maps damage estimates. So we use tax assessor data and also data called HAZUS data, Hazards of the US data, to show damage estimates that demonstrate the affected buildings at these types of flood inundations. So at this inundation, you can see there's almost 4,000 buildings that would be affected. And then it also shows the structural and content damage. So down there in the box in the left-hand corner, you can see that structural damage is nearly $40 million at this flood event. So again, communities just have this to really help them be better informed and prepared. We share this information with the media just because we recognize that they're the ones that are able to really get this information out to the public. So we have really great working relationships with them. And so this is just kind of a testimonial from former KCRG TV meteorologist Justin Geertz giving a testimonial about how helpful the stream stage sensors and the inundation maps have been. In addition to the community-based inundation maps, we also have these statewide flood maps that are available for every Iowa county across the state and for every stream draining more than 1 square mile. And this was about a $16 million project that we did in collaboration with the Department of Natural Resources and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And this was, again, kind of an outcome of the 2008 floods, recognizing that we really needed to update these maps for the entire state. So we currently have these available through the Flood Information System platform, and they share the flood extent for the 2, the 5, the 10, the 25, the 50, the 100, the 200, and the 500-year floodplain boundaries. You can access all of those different levels through IFAS. And they're currently non-regulatory, but FEMA is in the process of updating these maps on kind of a county by county basis. Following the 2019 floods on the Missouri River that I had mentioned, the Flood Center is working with some different state agencies and local partners to now come up with some real-time inundation mapping for the Missouri River. They were also really heavily impacted by flooding in 2011, and really the communities along the river have just been left kind of vulnerable and exposed from both of these events. And so we're working with these state partners to try and provide them with better information about how they might be able to better manage the floodplain areas in these parts of the state. And this is kind of an exciting project for the Flood Center, because when we were established, we really were just focusing on the internal rivers and streams in Iowa. But as we've grown and kind of demonstrated our technical abilities, we're now able to share our resources and information on more of these federally regulated rivers like the Missouri and the Mississippi River. So I've mentioned the flood information system platform that we've developed a lot throughout this presentation. It was something that we launched early on in our establishment, so it's been available since March 2011. And it's based on this Google Maps-based web interface, and it's freely available to anybody that can access this information. It provides information on those flood alerts and forecasts, the stream sensors, the flood maps, the statewide maps that I've mentioned. All of that information is available in IFAS. And then we also harvest hydrological and meteorological data from partners like the National Weather Service and USGS. And so we've really made IFAS kind of a one-stop web platform for people to go to try and figure out, better understand their flood risks and reduce those flood risks. And in 2019, the Iowa Flood Information System platform actually won the Hydrologic Warning Innovation Award from the National Hydrologic Warning Council. I mentioned another key part of our mission is just to be sharing the information and the tools and resources and our expertise across the state. So this is just an image of the Iowa Flood Center Director Witold Krajewski there on the left, with the Iowa Flood Center co-founder Larry Weber, and then Congressman Dave Loebsack on the right there. And this was when Congressman Loebsack was trying to pitch the Iowa Flood Center as actually a good home for a national flood center. And that's been something that's been a goal of ours for many years, something that we still are continuing to try and do, because we recognize that our tools and resources could be of value to a lot of other states as well. During normal times, when we're not quarantining and staying at home and having virtual meetings, we are out on the road all the time. So we go to state fairs, county fairs, we do lots of different STEM events, we do lots of K through 12 classroom presentations, and also with some of the local colleges, community colleges especially, where we put together workshops or programs for them. And so that's really a key component of the work that we do at the Iowa Flood Center. And we're anxious to kind of get back out there again and start doing that work. We also attend a lot of different conferences so that we can have booths where we're trying to network and reach some of those target audiences or key audiences. So the elected officials, emergency responders, and just general members from the public as well. We attend a lot of different watershed management authority meetings, and Kate will talk to you more about what the watershed management authorities are and kind of our work with them through the Iowa Watershed Approach. But this is just kind of an example of us giving a presentation at one of those meetings. And then all of the tools and resources that we've put together are frequently in the news, and we're working with partners in Missouri who are looking to us to develop a similar flood monitoring system. We've had conversations with folks from Wisconsin about how to develop a sensor network and hydrologic monitoring network like we've developed. We've hosted a couple different delegations from outside states within the last couple years that are really looking to us on how to not reinvent the wheel, but come up with similar strategies that they might be able to adapt in their home states to try and figure out and solve some of their flood problems as well. So we're proud of that, and we're happy to share our information with others who might be interested in learning more or looking to us as kind of a model for how they might develop and start to plan something similar. With that, I will turn it over to Kate, and she can talk about the Iowa Watershed Approach program.
Thanks, Breanna, for the excellent introduction to the Iowa Flood Center. Like Mike mentioned earlier, my name is Kate Giannini, and I serve as the Iowa Watershed Approach Communication Specialist at the Iowa Flood Center. Fun fact, Breanna and I used to work together at soil and water conservation districts. And that's where we really gained some valuable experience working with landowners, providing them technical experience, and also navigating those USDA programs. And that became really beneficial in the work that we do in watershed management today. So today I'm really excited to introduce to you the Iowa Watershed Approach program. The Iowa Watershed Approach program focuses on engaging voluntary landowners through these 8 watersheds highlighted here on this map in blue to reduce floods, improve water quality through a flood mitigation program by working with local watershed management authority boards. Secondly, we have developed community flood resilience programming to engage communities to better prepare for, recover from, and adapt to floods. The Iowa Watershed Approach, which I'll commonly refer to as the IWA, was built off the framework of a previously funded project from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or also known as HUD, from 2010 to 2016. This project was called the Iowa Watersheds Project. It can often be confused with the IWA. And through that funding, about $9 million was made available to work within these watersheds here in blue. So the Upper Cedar, Turkey River, Soap Creek, and the Middle Raccoon River to direct funds to install projects that would act for flood reduction and also improve water quality. Secondly, there was also some funding available to establish the first watershed management authorities in the state. That legislation was passed in 2010. Basically a watershed management authority is a governing board and creating an agreement between soil and water conservation districts, cities, and counties, all within a watershed. And most of them are at the size of a Huck 8 watershed. That you see here, the Turkey River would be a Huck 8, but they can also go down to a smaller watershed as well. And this really was advantageous for these different government entities to work across their political boundaries and build partnerships and work towards common natural resources goals and be able to leverage funds to work within those watersheds to improve water quality and also reduce floods. A good example for this is the case study of the Soap Creek watershed that was involved with the Iowa Watershed projects. The Soap Creek watershed actually was a grassroots effort that formed in the late 80s. It was landowners and decision makers like County Board of Supervisors and soil commissioners that came together and recognized that they were having frequent flooding events and they wanted to improve their landscape to create more flood storage on the landscape. They formed in the late 1980s and they really just kind of piecemealed funding for quite a few years to install practices like ponds and wetlands. In the late 80s, they also identified over 150 different locations throughout their watershed where they wanted to create more flood storage. They often looked at areas where bridges or box culverts were frequently flooded and that they had a huge maintenance issue because of the flooding. They wanted to create areas where they could create storage by an on-road structure, so raise that road and back water up to store that water. By 2012, the watershed board was able to install about 130 practices within their watershed. The IWP project came along and was able to also provide some more funding for construction. But what was really great is that we were able to leverage the the expertise at the Iowa Flood Center to do some computation modeling and measure the benefits that they had done in this watershed to see what the flood reduction had been over all these years of installing these practices. And that's what this graph shows here, where all the 150 locations where they have installed farm ponds, they are achieving at a 100-year storm at least a 43% reduction at the outlet of the Soap Creek. And this is a huge benefit to these landowners. And this is really great information provided to those decision makers so they could really see that all the work that they had put into their watershed was being benefit, and they were able to see that physically in the landscape as well. So along the IWP project occurred in 2015 along in the National Disaster Resilience Competition. Because of our previous HUD experience, many partners started to gather and start to put together a successful proposal to compete in this grant proposal. And this funding also came from HUD. And it was a collaboration between HUD and the Rockefeller Foundation. They had a funding level of $1 billion, and the states were able to compete for that funding. Some of the funding came through leftover Hurricane Sandy funding, and then the Rockefeller Foundation put in $500 million for that total for the $1 billion funding available. The vision really came to life with all the partnerships that from the previous project. We were able to come together and put together a successful proposal. Iowa would receive the 4th largest grant award of nearly $97 million for this Iowa Watershed Approach out of 14 applicants. So we were pretty proud of ourselves and our state for this unique project, and something that HUD is not normally that they would fund. They're usually focused on gray, hard infrastructure, and taking this type of approach where we're looking at nature-based infrastructure was a unique project for them. So how does the IWA program work? We learned a lot of lessons and gained some really valuable experience through the first HUD project. But we knew that we needed to start off with having that established governing board of the Watershed Management Authority. Watershed Management Authorities, the word authority probably wasn't the best suited for that when they created the legislation, and we've learned a lot from that since then. But really, they don't have any authority. It's just a very good way for these within the watershed to work together and collaborate. In a nutshell, this is the process and the timeline that we have completed over the past 4 years. These watersheds in blue establish a watershed management authority if they had not previously had done that before. Our heavy lift as the flood center, we developed a hydrological assessment. The watershed management authority boards hired a private consultant to develop a long-term vision for the watershed, so a watershed management plan. Most of these plans were looking at 20 years long-term vision to implement. They hired a project coordinator to be really the boots on the ground and work with the landowners within their watershed and drum up interest for the available construction dollars. And then as our team is very technical oriented, and as Breanna mentioned earlier, we deployed equipment so we could really monitoring the state of these streams to get a good baseline data, but also post-construction monitoring data as well. As the IWA project started in January of 2016, this is a map view of all the watershed management authorities that had formed. There was about 15 in the state that had formed. And as of now, the Iowa Watershed Management Authorities across the state, we have about 26 that have developed. So quite a few boards have been developed since the beginning of IWA. And we really believe that the IWA gave these governing boards new possibilities to kind of reach beyond their political boundaries and kind of form new relationships and leverage funding to achieve common goals. So about 40% of the state is now covered in watershed management authority, and we think that's really great. Our team developed the hydrological assessment that was fed into each of the watershed management plans that are being developed by the private consultants. We really look at all the physical conditions within a watershed. What are the soils, the topography, the land use, what's the existing data and equipment that's out in that watershed? How does that watershed function hydrologically? We also work with other state agencies as well. The Iowa Department of Natural Resources and the Iowa State Extension worked very hard on actually mapping every best management practice in our state using LIDAR data. This was extremely valuable for the planning process and for the project coordinators and for our computational modeling at the Iowa Flood Center. Additionally, we were able to pair that data from the existing, by mapping all the existing best management practices in the state with the Agriculture Conservation Planning Framework tool. So a USDA tool, it's called the ACPF. We were able to run this through the help of Iowa DNR and staff and students in all 330 Hut 12s within the IWA. And this gave us a look of what our potential practices are in these watersheds, and really marrying those two in a technical standpoint. We were able to take a look, okay, these are the practices that are on the landscape. These are our potential practices on the landscape. Where do we have some needs? So these were two really great tools that we could utilize, but also the project coordinators could utilize when they were going out into the field to meet with landowners, and maybe even suggest, maybe they were meeting with a landowner for a certain resource concern, but they were able to look at the ACPF tool and provide some different alternatives for that landowner as well. One of the biggest lifts is that the Iowa Center completed is our GHOST computational model. So this is a model that we developed for the Iowa Watershed Approach program. And what it does is capture about 15 years of continuous rainfall data and transposes that onto the watershed through a computer model. So it simulates that hydrological response of how that on the surface and also the subsurface of how that watershed works when we have those rainfall events. And what's really amazing is that through that model, we were able to create what if landscape scenarios. So what if we put in 500 ponds and wetlands within this watershed? What would the flood reductions be? So this is a really great tool to hand off to the watershed planners and the coordinators and decision makers so they know how to strategize their goals and budgets for the future. Some of the other scenarios we looked at was soil health. What if all the row crop acres in a watershed had a soil health scenario where they were doing no-till and installing cover crops? What would the flood reduction be at certain points within that river to quantify the best measure impact for that watershed? We can look at other scenarios too. What if we just put 50% cover crops within that watershed? What would the flood reduction be? We also looked at perennial landscape, so giving us a good baseline data of what that watershed may have looked at like in historically, and that gives a good idea of some goals that we can reach for as well. We also looked at climate change data by pulling the Midwest Climate Science Report, and with increased precipitation in mind, what does that look like in the future? How do we need to set our goals in the future based on increased precipitation that's going to occur? And we all know that farmers love data, and just as much as engineers. So this is two landowners, Jared and Stuart Moss in the Clear Creek watershed, and they were happy to host one of our hydro stations across the IWA project. And these hydro stations collect rainfall data, wind speed and direction. It's also coupled with a soil temperature at 2, 4, 8, and 20 inches under subsurface in the ground, which is excellent for planting in the spring. And there's also a groundwater well associated with our hydro stations. All this data is uploaded every 15 minutes to the platform that Breanna spoke about, the Iowa Flood Information System. And that's something that farmers and landowners really want to utilize when in their operations. So it also can be a good talking point with their neighbors. Hey, what are you doing over there? It's a good way to talk about conservation. And it's often brought up at local coffee shops as well. So to date, through the Iowa Watershed Approach project, we are able to provide 90% cost share to landowners to install these projects. This is an extremely competitive cost share rate, and we didn't have problems with landowners signing on. To date, we have over 1,000 projects that have been sited, designed, and may be under construction. Right now, we had a really busy construction year in 2020. Nearly 500 projects have been installed in 2020. And we've nearly allocated all of our fundings for this flood mitigation program. We couldn't do that without the watershed management authority boards, their project coordinators that are meeting with the landowners and engaging the landowners, and also the contractors. The photo that you see at the bottom right is a contractor meeting for the Clear Creek watershed. From my previous experience, I was thinking that we'd get 20, 25 contractors to show up, learn about the project and the funds available. And we had nearly 100 people in that room to learn about this project. So really engaging community around this project. And I want to highlight some of the projects that were constructed this year. So it's about an 8-acre pond, pool area pond going into the Middle Cedar watershed. They wrapped up construction before the winter hit. We were able to collect some really great drone footage of that project going in. This is a wetland. It's a 25-acre complex, and the Middle Cedar watershed, there was some stream mitigation that occurred in this area. It will be, once it's completed, it will be seeded down to natives in the disturbed areas that you see, and also a cool season buffer for future fire management. Again, another wetland complex. This is a 20-acre wetland complex, also in the Middle Cedar watershed. This is actually owned by a local county conservation board, and this will be open to the public to enjoy. This is our project coordinator, John Rathbun, for the Clear Creek watershed, standing next to a flood mitigation project in the Clear Creek project watershed that was installed this past fall. Additionally, this landowner also installed this pond on their property. They eagerly signed up for 5 different projects through our program. So they have one more project to install, and they're really looking forward to that. So I kind of went through the flood mitigation side and highlighted the projects that we're installing, but I wanted to talk about our community resilience program as well. And we kind of define the flood resilience as the ability for the community within a watershed to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and to recover from a flood. Through the flood resilience program, we are working with local organizations to create flood resilience action plans within smaller communities within the IWA watersheds. Some of those local organizations were resource and conservation developments, or RC&Ds. Some of them were private consultants, or a local college that had really great connection to the local community. To give an example of one of the projects, this is the It has about a population of 5,000. It sits along the banks of the Cedar River, just upstream of the city of Cedar Rapids. And they were going through the process of developing a flood resilience action plan with the Iowa Valley RC&D. With the Iowa Valley RC&D, they engage right away with the city personnel, public health agencies, Iowa State Extension, emergency managers, faith-based communities, to really engage them and have public meetings to hear from them how flooding impacts their community. With the goals to develop this flood resilience action plan and look for future funding to work on those goals. One of my favorite things they did was that they held 3 public meetings with community residents just to kind of listen in, hear their flood stories, but also they held a flood resilience tournament seen here in this photo. And really a flood resilience tournament is a way to engage different stakeholders within the watershed and assume different roles through a mock flood event. So a resident might come in, they might get assigned a role to be the mayor for the day or through this flood event, and then only given a certain amount of resources. It's a really fun event that's interactive. And I think what it shows, it really enlightens people of all the different roles that occur and their stressors during a flood event, and it really kind of opened their eyes what happens when they're having a flood event. This flood resilience action plan has been completed. It's available on the Flood Resilient Vinton website. It's also available on our Iowa Watershed Approach website. Another example is the Flood Resilient Coralville. We contracted with Estate Planning, a private consultant, to develop their flood resilience action plan. They had very similar approach to the Iowa Valley RC&D in the Flood Resilient Vinton project. But what stood out on this one is that they engaged with the community food pantry to connect with socially vulnerable populations within their watershed. And they also created this really great business campaign where they worked with businesses, nonprofits, and faith-based institutions to pledge that they would provide support during a flood event. So they were able to collect that data and that information and provide that to the key essential personnel like city staff, emergency managers, so they know when a flood event is occurring, who in the community can they look to, who can supply food, supplies, water, shelter, volunteers, etc. Lastly, the last project I wanted to highlight in the resilience program is the Bee Branch Healthy Homes program. This project is located in the city of Dubuque. This watershed is entirely within the city limits, and over 50% of the residents live and work within this watershed. So a lot of engagement in the Bee Branch watershed. The neighborhood includes historic homes, and also it's very culturally diverse. And it hosts a lot of affordable housing for low to moderate income residents. This area was known to be frequently flooded for many, many years. So the city began in 2013 to begin construction to daylight Bee Creek. So that creek actually had been for many, many years under pipe underground. So and that's why they were receiving a lot of frequent flooding issues in that watershed. So they started construction to daylight this creek in 2013. They conducted buyouts, they improved stormwater infrastructure in this area, and they also developed the Bee Branch Healthy Homes Initiative. Because of the frequent flooding historically, this area, many residents had developed health concerns such as asthma due to moldy and wet basements in that area. So the IWA assisted with funds with the stormwater improvements, but also with this Bee Branch Healthy Homes program, providing about $8 million of forgivable loans to residents in this area to make improvements to their basements, install new water and heater and furnaces, so utilities in the basement, but also to move them up off the ground a little bit, new gutters, and this was extremely valuable to this area. So much of my work with the Iowa Watershed Approach is outreach, engagement, communication. So we have a really amazing website. We provide quarterly newsletters. I'm constantly in contact with other state partners in the watershed management authorities, their boards and their project coordinators. We create story maps on an annual basis to highlight some of the achievements. Our project coordinators are meeting with the media. They're hosting field days when they can. This year, they worked with Iowa State Extension to host virtual field days, which has been super successful. And we're always tapping into our local hero farmers to get them in front of the camera as much as they don't like it. In 2019, we were able to host a delegation through a partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund to host North Carolinians to come to Iowa to learn about the Iowa Flood Center, but also the Iowa Watershed Approach program. They have been hit by several hurricanes with inland flooding and also coastal flooding, and we're looking to our expertise on how they could replicate certain programs in their state as well. We had planned to reciprocate that visit and go to North Carolina in 2020, and in March of 2020, and we all know what happened then, but we are still hopeful that we get to return this visit, hopefully in 2022. Also, we hosted a delegation from Texas. They came in January of 2020, so just before COVID hit. And I don't know what they were thinking, a bunch of Texans coming to Iowa in January, but they were eager to meet with us and learn about our resources and how they can replicate some of our tools and resources in Texas. We all know that Texas has been impacted heavily with hurricanes, especially from Hurricane Harvey, and they will be receiving some disaster funds in the future. So they wanted to use our expertise and develop a certain programs in their area as well. We will meet with them and to check in with them next month, and we are looking forward to keeping in touch with these partners. And here's just a quote from one of the visitors that came through that. So it says, Iowa really knows they've modeled and mapped the state. They have great data, visualization tools, and they have really effective outreach and communication to really have a complete flood approach. You have to do all of those things. So great recognition from our partners in Texas. And we couldn't do what we do without these partners. So I think that's the biggest thing is that we pride ourselves on, is that we take the time to build the relationships and network, and that has gone very far for us. With that, we can close it out from here and take any questions. Thank you.
All right, Breanna and Kate, I really appreciate that. That was some excellent information. I hope our participants enjoyed it as much as I did. And just a reminder for everyone to return to the meeting agenda and pick the next session that you'd like to attend from the NACD annual meeting. I want to thank everybody for attending today.